afternoon. My name is Chloe Adcock, and I am the coordinator for this year's International Development Roundtable Series. The Development Roundtable is a high-profile speaker series where leaders and scholars within the international development sphere address our students, faculty, and the wider community on trends and challenges that are shaping the field. The roundtable today is actually special because it's co-sponsored by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Agora Institute. So on behalf of everyone in the IDEV community, as well as the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Agora Institute, I would like to welcome you all to the first roundtable event of the semester with our esteemed guest, Dr. James Robinson. Dr. Robinson is a renowned political scientist and economist who has focused much of his career to the underlying relationship between poverty and the institutions of a society and how those institutions emerge out of political conflicts. He is currently the Institute Director of the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts at the University of Chicago. He has also served as an advisor to the World Bank, the Swedish Development Policy Council, and on the board of the Global Development Network. Today, he will be talking with Dr. Yascha Mounk about his most recent book, The Narrow Corridor: States, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty. The Narrow Corridor is about the delicate balance between state and society and how this underlying balance keeps countries on a path to prosperity or can push them to authoritarianism or to anarchy. Dr. Yascha Mounk is a senior fellow at the Agora Institute and the author of the book, The People versus Democracy: Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Fix It. So without further ado, I would like to hand the floor over to Dr. Mounk so we can jump right in.
I've had the pleasure of reading this book over the last weeks. It is a fantastic follow-up to a fantastic book, but it has a puzzling title, The Narrow Corridor. What on earth is The Narrow Corridor, James?
The Narrow Corridor. The narrow corridor, well, it was going to be called The Balance of Power, but then we decided that sounds like some kind of international relations book, or like a diplomacy, you know. Henry Kissinger would have written a book called The Balance of Power. So we thought this is a bit obscure, but the idea of the narrow corridor is that that's the place that a society has to get into if it wants to achieve liberty for its citizens. That's the idea.
And so more specifically, it's a balance between sort of state capacity and society. Is that right? So what does it look like when those things are in balance, and what benefits flow from that?
Yeah, I think that's right. So you know, what we want is, you know, the idea here is to try to focus people on maybe a different dependent variable, which is liberty, and then try to ask, you know, try to develop a kind of parsimonious theory of what explains the incredible variation of liberty you see in the world, and what are some of the consequences of that. Obviously, we're economists, so we have a self-control problem. We can't stop ourselves writing about economics, especially Daron. But
as a political scientist, I thought the self-control problem economists have is that they can't stop themselves writing from everything other than the economy.
Yeah, I'm a recovering economist, you know. Yeah. So we want to talk about liberty. We want to talk about the variation in liberty in the world, and how do you think about that? Where does that come from? And as you're alluding to, the way we think about that is that there's a sort of fundamental competition, you know, between the state and society, that the state wants to control society and society wants to not be controlled, and it wants to control the state. So that there's a kind of game, you know, which is sort of fundamentally describe what goes on in society, but there's different outcomes from that game. You know, that could be the state can dominate society, and that, think about China or something as an example of that. But that's not the only possibility. It's also true that society, in some sense, can dominate the state. So what's an example of that? Yemen, let's say, you know. So, or you can get this balance. You can get the balance, and the part of the sort of the parameter space, you know, you could say, the part, you know, where you get this balance, that's the narrow corridor, where the state and society are balanced, and that, we argue, is the circumstances in which liberty emerges.
So one of the things I like very much about this sort of conceptual model is that it inverts some of the assumptions we tend to have in contemporary politics, right? So often in contemporary politics, we think, well, we need a really strong society because the real danger to liberty is the state, right? It's the state that is in danger of turning tyrannical, that is in danger of throwing people who dislike the government to jail and all those kinds of things. So if you're thinking about how to build liberty, you mostly have to think about how to shackle the Leviathan, how to make sure that the state stays in its place. And that's obviously, from Hayek all the way down to a lot of sort of ideological directions today, that's a very recognizable political tradition. So what does that get wrong? What happens when we manage to shackle the state too well?
Yeah. Well, I think what it gets wrong, this is a sort of obvious thing to me, given where I work in the world in developing countries. It's the countries which have extremely weak states, like Haiti, or Sierra Leone, they don't have much economic development, and they certainly don't have liberty either, And, that's partly for Hobbesian reasons, you could say, but not completely for Hobbesian reasons. There's a lot of disorder, in places where there's no state. So the state has to be strong enough to kind of provide basic public goods and order and resolve disputes, and but you can't expect a state on its own to do that, necessarily. So that's what Hobbes Hobbes didn't get the second part. He understood that you had to have a state to do these things, but he underestimated the importance of the governance of the state. So I think, surely the state can be a threat to liberty, but having state capacity of some sort, those relatively strong states, is absolutely necessary for liberty as well. And I think you see that if you look at many developing countries in the world today. So I think that intuition is an intuition which is kind of honed by thinking too much about Western developed societies.
So you described beautifully the TIF, which I knew nothing about. What does that look like there? That's a case in which the state is too weak.
Yeah, I think
and it creates huge economic problems. So you're allowed to talk about the economy for a minute. No, I'll cut you off. We talk too much about the economy. But also huge problems for human liberty. Yeah.
So that's one of our motivating examples of to think about this situation where the state is stronger than society. So I mentioned Yemen, but in the book we also talk about a lot of ethnographic examples, and the TIV is particularly interesting because it was so well observed ethnographically by Paul and Laura Bohannon, these two anthropologists, and they were particularly interested in the politics. So the TIV, at the time of British colonization, were a stateless, what anthropologists used to call a stateless society in southeastern Nigeria. So they were, it wasn't a small scale society, it was big, there were millions of people, they spoke the same language, they had a common kind of history and religion. They were a sort of lineage society, so they all traced their ancestry back, through this kinship to a kind of probably mythical ancestor. And they didn't have a state. So why didn't they have a state? So Bohannon was particularly interested in that. And what he showed is that essentially they didn't have a state because people were so terrified of hierarchy. They didn't like hierarchy. They didn't want to start creating hierarchy, so that if you're going to have a state, you need to have hierarchy. Someone needs to be in charge. Someone needs to start telling somebody else what to do. And what Bohannon showed is that he related these different ethnographic stories showing that essentially whenever that started happening, then that person would be accused of being a witch. And the whole structure of witchcraft accusations was kind of designed to level the playing field and make sure that there was no kind of political hierarchy emerged. And that sounds like a pretty exotic example, but actually what we try to show in the book is that that's the story kind of all over the place. That's also the story in Yemen. Where did all these Houthis come from? The Houthis are these people from the north of Yemen, who basically don't like the control of the central state in Sana'a, and this is a sort of rebellion against, an attempt to centralize authority.
Now, if you don't have authority, I can see why it's a problem for economic growth. Why is it a problem for human liberty? Why doesn't that just mean that on a classical understanding of liberty, which means the absence of constraints, there's no state capacity to tell me what to do, I can do whatever I want, hurrah.
Yeah, right, so I think that's great. So I think, so one reason that this could be kind of antithetical to liberty would be a sort of straightforward Hobbesian, there's war, there's kind of disorder or whatever. And there's quite a bit of that, in rural, Nigeria. But actually, there's not as much as Hobbes would have thought. And I think so the other argument we make is that, what you see is that in a society where there's no kind of really effective centralized authority, people create all sorts of norms, which make it difficult for the type of thing Hobbes studied to emerge. So you anticipate that without centralized authority, there are going to be problems. There's going to be disputes. You don't have mechanisms for resolving disputes. So therefore, you structure society in a way as to make it unlikely that disputes will arise, okay? So Bohannon actually talked about the economy like that in some sense. He kind of showed how in the TIV economy, it was organized in some sense so that disputes wouldn't arise. You know, if you start exchanging and trading, and then people are going to, you know, there's no standardized weights and measures, and people are going to start. So you want to stop those conflicts ever arising. So he describes this, what he calls a separate spheres of exchange. So that was a kind of substitute for having a state. But of course, it created terrible economic incentives, putting my economist hat back on again. You know, this wasn't the way to organize a modern economy, but it was perfectly rational given the situation they were in. They couldn't solve this political problem, and they used many other strategies. So we call this the cage of norms in the book. That you know, life without a state isn't quite like Hobbes imagined, because society creates lots of norms which reduce the potential for the type of disorder that he emphasized. So.
Yeah, and that was really a clarifying part for me in the book, because it shows that we need the state in order to free us from this cage of norms. And these norms can be incredibly oppressive in these societies. So that actually, where you don't have any state at all, or where you have insufficient state capacity, it's not just that you end up having war and civil conflict and all those kinds of things. It's that actually your neighbors hold you accountable for following a very, very minute set of rules and so on. And that to me was fascinating. I was wondering, when I was reading those parts of the book, how much that applies to the countries which are broadly in the right part of the corridor at the moment, which is to say, do you think that there's any live danger that in a country like the United States or like Germany or like Sweden, society could become so strong that the state starts to wither again? Or are the people in those societies who say, well, look, in our context, the biggest danger to human liberty is actually the state, which keeps getting more capacities and so on, onto something? I mean, is there both risks in those countries, or is the only live risk in a country like the United States that the state falls in the hands of somebody who can quash society? But it's harder perhaps to think about what it would look like for society to be able to shackle the Leviathan in a country that already has developed state capacity.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think one thing we sort of put, so we have this simple theory, you know, with this balance between the state and society, and then we try to look historically and try to ask, you know, why did different parts of the world get into these different equilibria? You know, why was it in China that this did, you know, I'm sort of joining the dots here, but I'll come back, you know, to why was it, you know, how did China get into this despotic kind of equilibrium, you know, or why was it in sub-Saharan Africa you have these other types of constellations with this absent Leviathan, and what's the historical roots of this particular balance in Western Europe or North America, for example? And I do think, you know, we emphasize you can get into the corridor. I think we emphasize there, for example, that, you know, as far back as you go, I mean, you know, society in Western Europe, for example, doesn't look like Africa. You know, it doesn't even, you go back to the Middle Ages, you know, what we know about kinship groups and the way society is organized, it doesn't look like the TIV, you know. So it's never, European society kind of never looked like that. Why? I don't know the answer to that. You know, this is not something that there's a theory of in social science, to my knowledge. You know, it's fascinating, but that, you know, that's just a fact for the purposes of this. So society never looked, and maybe that's also important, you know, in terms of getting this thing going and staying in the corridor. But we also emphasize, as you're saying, that, you know, you can jump out of the corridor. So the story we tell, for example, about, you know, the roots of this particular, how did Europe get itself into the corridor, is this balance emerges between a very kind of participatory society, mostly from German tribes at the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The German tribes, like the Franks, kind of merged their very participatory institutions with late Roman state institutions, administrative institutions, fiscal institutions, legal institutions. So that's sort of it's a sort of historical juncture where this balance kind of emerges. It's not something anyone designed, it just kind of emerges at that moment. And then then you're in the corridor, and the idea, the long kind of durée idea is that once you're in the corridor, then there's things reinforce themselves, and you tend to stay in the corridor. But also, obviously, you can jump out of the corridor. So if you think of the corridor, on either side, there's the state dominating or the society dominating. Logically, you can jump out. You can jump out in either direction. And certainly, what we try to emphasize is that the pressure can come in either direction. So elites could try to capture the state and create something much more despotic, but it could also be that citizens, become disillusioned with the ability of institutions to cope with problems, or the problems run ahead of the institutions, and so citizens can overthrow, a shackled Leviathan. And that, I think that's the story about the overthrow of Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic, in some sense, there were lots of elites, Prussian elites or military elites who didn't like the Weimar Republic. But in the end, there was also a lot of popular pressure, popular disillusionment with the legitimacy of the Weimar Republic. And in some sense,
but the end result of that was on the other end, right? So what you end up getting is a state that dominates over society in the Third Reich. So I guess I'm wondering, is there a pathway where society ends up dominating over the state? I mean, perhaps from what you were just saying, the best scenario for it, or the most likely scenario for it, would be that citizens no longer trust the state being able to deliver on public goods, and therefore they become unwilling to pay taxes, and therefore it becomes harder for the state to deliver on public goods, and so therefore, so there may be a kind of vicious cycle where you end up getting an erosion of state capacity, but we haven't really seen that play out anywhere that I can think of.
I agree. I mean, you can think of examples where the state utterly and truly collapsed. Afghanistan. Where the army just went home. The police, the bureaucrats closed the door, and they just, it just disappeared. So, but obviously that was never a country that was in the corridor in our terminology. So I think, I'm not sure I have a good explanation for that. I think what it seems to be that once you're in the corridor, you have this notion of the state, then there's that sort of blueprint there. And even if it collapses, it's going to get recreated. You never sort of converge to, Central African Republic. Sure, the state collapsed in the Central African Republic, but, that was never close to the corridor in our terminology. So I don't really have a micro foundation for that, but you're right, yeah.
So let's focus on the other end of a corridor, on the other wrong side of a corridor. So what does a state look like where society never really gets a chance against the state, where the state is dominant from the beginning? What are the bad consequences from that?
Well, I think the consequences. What's nice to me about talking about liberty, and saying that that's something humans value, is that we're not going to have a discussion about whether there's liberty with Chinese characteristics. We could have a discussion about whether there's a trade-off between liberty and economic growth. Maybe Chinese people would like liberty. They seem to be pretty interested in liberty in Hong Kong, and my former colleague Gary King with Jennifer Pan and Margaret Roberts has this very interesting work looking at Chinese censorship. And the one thing the Chinese government are very keen on censoring in the internet is anything to do with people organizing collectively, complaining about the system, and but you could sort of say, well, okay, but there's no liberty in China really, but people are willing to make a trade-off between liberty and economic growth. But I think the big picture is, coming back reluctantly to talk about economics, that liberty seems to be our view. About every economist agrees what drives economic growth: innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship. That's what we know since the work of Robert Solow in the 1950s. That's what generates economic growth: technological innovation, new ways of raising productivity, etc. Invention. Okay, where does that come from? That comes from human creativity. It comes from people's ideas and dreams and passions and projects, and that's where it comes from. And how do you foment that in a society? I'd say that is closely connected to kind of liberty, to having freedom, without being under the sway of other people, and to just do your thing and not be worried about people telling you off or trying to control you, or, so I would say, if you thought about Chinese economic growth, there's just something that sort of fundamentally doesn't add up, between the lack of, the lack of liberty and economic growth. We say why nations fail. Yeah, you can have transitory periods of economic growth like that. There's lots of experiences of that in world history. And, in the Chinese case, for idiosyncratic reasons, there's things which help that happen. I think when you read about Chinese history, this whole notion of like meritocracy, which as a British working class person, I find like a bizarre idea, That's something that came to Britain extremely recently, and imperfectly, this notion of meritocracy. That goes back, 2,500 years in China. Confucius talked about meritocracy. It goes back even before Confucius. So this principle of this meritocratic organization of society as a kind of norm, well, it turns out that's a very, very useful thing to have, if the Communist Party decides it's going to push economic development, okay? So, and that's not something most societies can appeal to. You can't appeal to that principle in Africa or Latin America or India, for heaven's sake. But that just happens to be something that works in the Chinese favor, But I guess, I would say, and what we would say is, is that that's not a sustainable model for economic growth. That concentrated, personalized political power, which is what you have in China, always end up getting abused, at the expense of liberty and at the whatever liberty there is, and at the expense of prosperity as well. So
I have two questions that are coming out of this. One of which is on China, and one of those is sort of the beginning of an argument you're making about universal values. So on China, in Why Nations Fail, I took the takeaway to be somewhat bearish on China, that they have made, as you were just saying, this great economic leap because they have some positive traditions like meritocracy, and they sort of maximized how far you can get under relatively economically extractive institutions. But because we don't have fully economically inclusive institutions, there's going to be a limit to how much a country can grow. I take it that in this book you have a similarly pessimistic stance on the prospects for human liberty in China, that this is a country in which the state has always dominated over society, and this is ongoing, and it's going to reduce liberty. So two questions. A, is that right? Or do we have to be pessimistic about the prospect of both freedom and economic growth in China? And B, what would it look like for China to get into the corridor? Is it possible for China to get into the corridor if society develops enough and somehow manages to semi-shackle the Leviathan in exactly the requisite way? Or do you think that the path dependency here is so strong that there's no realistic prospect of it happening?
Yeah, I don't think there's much prospect of it happening. In the sense of, if you look at what's going on now in China, they're creating this kind of Orwellian machine. What is it, 200 million face recognition cameras being put up all over the place, the social credit system. They're trying to harness modern technology to kind of really keep control of everybody. So culturally, is it possible? Yes, of course, look at Taiwan. Taiwan has this extremely liberal society, very democratic, completely changed. That's all culturally Chinese. But maybe there was big shocks to the system. There were the Japanese and whatever. So to me, this is much more about. This is not a cultural argument. So this is not an argument about how Chinese people don't value liberty. Yes, Chinese people are different in Chinese society is different from Western society. But I think as I said, what you see going on in Hong Kong at the moment is sort of strongly consistent with this idea that actually, Chinese people do value liberty. It's just they can't get it because of this hegemony of the state over society, which is so. It's rooted in. I don't know. This is going to sound like a cultural argument. I'm not sure I really understand it. It's obviously rooted in norms. Like going back to Confucius. Confucius said, the common people don't debate government. So there's no notion of like accountability in the Western, and that's deeply rooted as a kind of norm of how things are done. People may not like that, but obviously it influences their expectations. If you look at all of this very interesting social media discussion in the United States about what's going in Hong Kong, and you have these Hong Kong students saying, You know, I don't feel Chinese, you know, whatever. We want democracy. And Chinese students attacking them and saying, you're a traitor, you know. So why are they doing that in the United States? You know, they're not doing that. They're doing that because they have some notion of how we organize things in China, and you're deviating from it. And there's some norm. And that, you know, maybe that's true. Also, there's a different sort of cage of norms, which is, you know, deeply rooted in this historical path in China, it seems to me.
So now I think I'm less clear on the role of universal values and norms in the book than I was before. So let me push you a little bit on that. So you have, you know, these different traditions that try to make reference to culture and norms in order to explain political outcomes, right? So one is the sort of Asian values debate, where, you know, certain Asian statesmen basically said, look, you Westerners with your emphasis on especially democracy, but sort of certain forms of understanding of individual freedom, that's just not what our society is like. We have much more collective norms and values, and that's equally good. And so you can't judge us by these Western standards, but perhaps our societies in certain respects don't give people the kind of freedom that you're talking about in this book, because that's just the choices that we've made, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? There's also sort of a strangely similar inverse, more negative argument, which is certain people within the West who say, well, there's something special about the Western tradition, and we are wonderful because we care about all of these things, whereas these people in other parts of the world who don't really care about that stuff, and that's why we're always going to have tyranny and so on, right? So I take it that you think that individual freedom is a universal aspiration, that people want to gain the things you get from being in the narrow corridor everywhere, but that for various historical reasons, some countries have more trouble getting to it than others.
I think that's the big story. You know, I think that if that wasn't the big story, then the Chinese wouldn't be so worried about monitoring everybody and and repressing and censoring like crazy. You know, so they're worried because it has the obvious consequences. So I think that's a big story. I do think like personally, kind of going off. We're all academics here, you know. So going off message, you know, for like 1 minute. You know, in my experience, you know, a lot of social theory is very Eurocentric. You know, a lot of social theory, you know, Marxism is perhaps the most egregious example, you know, of a social theory that was kind of developed to explain a particular moment in European history, and then was then projected out, you know, into the world as if we could explain everything through class struggle. You know, well, I've done a lot of work in Sierra Leone, and I've never met very many capitalists or proletarians in Sierra Leone. You know, it's just not relevant as a way of thinking about the historical development of other parts of the world. You know, and I think that's obviously the case in Africa. You know, I think it's also true in Latin America, even though it's kind of a little more plausible to pretend about Latin America. But I don't think it's true about Latin America either. So I do think, you know, like we need to think much more about that. We need to understand as social scientists much better the perspective of the rest of the world, you know. And so so I tend to have like identity crisis in moments of weakness, you know. So I think, you know, you could criticize this book for, you know, it's in the spirit of why nations fail. I'm a little anxious that we don't understand well enough these things you're talking to. So, but you know, I think we got it right, but I also think we don't understand it. You know, I've been working in Haiti the last couple of years, and you know, I just decided in the summer, you know, that I just really don't understand like what goes on in Haiti. Like, I just don't understand politics. You know, I just like what people are achieving and how they're trying to achieve it, and what they. I know it's not through elections and stuff like that, but how it's actually working, I think I realized I just don't understand. You know, and so that's. But that's, I think, you know, that's, if you think you understand everything, you can't learn anything in academia. So that's I think it's healthy to kind of feel ignorant, you know. You might wonder how I managed to write such a big book in that state of mind. But
that's hard to follow up on. Yeah, I mean, I think that danger is very well described. I see the danger not just in class terms, but in some other terms that we currently use in the United States, but are really derived from particularities of American history, and then we sort of want to understand the whole world seen through that prism. And I think that's always a serious danger to think through. The first chapter's name is How Does History End? I mean, I haven't been able to escape wondering in the last things you said about whether or not you believe in the thesis of the end of history. Now, you know, the end of history is often misunderstood as arguing that there's no longer going to be any historical events or anything like that. Fukuyama is very clear about the fact that he doesn't mean that, but he thinks that political systems that have individual self-determination and collective self-determination, so individual freedom and some form of collective democratic rule, just end up having fewer internal contradictions and therefore greater legitimacy over time. Now, you don't seem to believe that different societies will converge on that. You think that there's parts of a world in which the state has huge predominance, like in China, in which we're not likely to get into the corridor anytime soon, and there's parts of the world on the other side where society has always been so strong, but the state hasn't been able to develop, well, we'll end up on the other side of the corridor. But it does seem a little bit as though everybody has this aspiration towards economic growth and individual freedom and political participation, and that societies that are within this corridor seem in certain respects more stable. So is this a sort of very different reformulation of Fukuyama's end of history?
Yeah, I don't believe the positive claim, obviously, but what you're saying is that Fukuyama didn't really advance a positive claim. He advanced a kind of more normative claim that there was a sort of convergence in terms of what a legitimate political institution looked like. But I'm not sure I believe that either. I mean, I think, you know, I think if you thought about the positive claim for these kind of, there's these divergence between these different types of societies, you know, different types of societies create different types of ideologies, you know, to kind of reinforce those equilibria or support those equilibria. And, you know, if you looked at in Africa, for example, if you asked, what does, this is not a question that political philosophers seem to ask very much, but it's a question I try to ask myself. It's like, what does African political theory look like, okay? So in Africa you have, you know, so you have all these very decentralized societies. You have a few big states, very decentralized societies, you know, but they're grappling with these political problems. You know, that's what Bohannon's work is so kind of vivid on. So they have all sorts of political ideas about legitimacy and power and authority and where that comes from. And I don't think that looks like John Locke. You know, it doesn't look like Madison or Western political theory. It's meant to think about the problems and what are hybrid solutions. So, you know, many African societies, they didn't manage to solve this problem the way, you know, Western European societies did. But they created all sorts of hybrid solutions to that problem, and they have all sorts of philosophical ideas around that too. So I don't think that is a convergence to liberal democracy. It's a completely different way of thinking about the issues. And I think it's true. I guess the way I think about this is, you know, yes, I think most Africans that I know, of course they'd like public goods and they'd like prosperity and they'd like all the opportunities that I've had in life. But how do you organize your society to deliver that? That's not an easy thing.
One of the wonderful things about sort of sweeping historical analyses like these is that it really does allow you to understand the deep historical roots of a lot of contemporary phenomena we often struggle to understand or understand in a really shallow way. The thing that can be depressing about it is precisely that it makes you say, well, you know, if the reasons for the different kind of shape that, you know, China and the United States and parts of the Congo have today lies in these inflection points, some of which lay centuries ago, it makes us feel quite disempowered about what we can do today. And one of the wonderful things about science is how international school it is. So I'm sure that there's students in the audience who are thinking, well, I'm from one of those countries that is on one side of a corridor where the state is always dominated. I'm from one of those other countries where we've never managed to build up sufficient state capacity. Should they just abandon their degree and go home and give up on this changing? What can we do to try and get into the corridor? Is that just not the right way of thinking about it?
Well, you know, I mean, it's funny the perception. Like many people say that you know, Daron, our work is sort of pessimistic because it's kind of deeply rooted in history. It's sort of ironic actually, because when we first started doing this work, gosh, you know, we started first thinking about these questions, you know, 25 years ago. we were very inspired by trying to show that all this work by Jeffrey Sachs was nonsense. You know, this idea that geography, somehow Africa was poor because there was malaria and the tsetse fly, you know, and it was too close to the equator. And you know, we were very inspired in a lot of our academic work to sort of show that the data just didn't support that idea. So we thought we were actually proposing something extremely optimistic relative to this kind of geographical determinism. And then it turns out, like, you know, once we kind of buried that, I think, it keeps coming back, you know, but we think we more or less buried it, you know, then people say, oh, you're so pessimistic, this view of the world, you know. But I just think that's the way the world is. You know, it's very difficult to change society. You know, I've worked for many years in Colombia. I teach in Bogota, taught in Bogota every summer for 25 years. And my wife is Colombian. And you just see, like, all of these attempts to kind of change things in Colombia, you know, like, kind of go nowhere, you know. Either they're successful for a few years, or they peter out, or they don't scale up, or they're very localized, and they work in some local, you know, so there's many people, so I just, you know, you see the barriers and these mechanisms all the time making this change difficult. Of course, you know, every society, you know, like, to use the language of Why Nations Fail, you know, that's inclusive, kind of was extractive historically, and it became more inclusive because people demanded, you know, they demanded rights, they organized collectively, they changed institutions, they, you know, but I do think that, you know, the history suggests that's a difficult thing to do. You know, I do think, you know, the big picture, we talk about this a little bit at the end, is, you know, I do think there is progress. You know, there's progress. The world's a better place than it used to be. You know, there's no slavery anymore, for example, you know, and there's notion of rights, you know, which has become very powerful, it seems to me, in terms of, you know, women's rights or minority rights and you know, kind of empowerment of indigenous groups. You know, of course, that turns out to be a difficult thing to handle. But, you know, if you look at Bolivia, for example, Bolivia is an amazing country now. You can have, like, indigenous women cabinet ministers, like unthinkable 20 years ago when the country was run by just, like, white men, you know. So that's of course, that's a fabulous thing. You know, it's very hard to kind of channel that, you know, and all that energy and empowerment. But that's a great thing, you know. And so you know, so there is that. So there is that, you know. And I think that, you know, we know there's a drift towards democracy, and so it's just. It's slow, you know. It's a slow. So I think, and you know, and it's not a, you know. But in all of these cases, you know, it's individuals, you know, who got going, who got organized, or, you know, how did all these indigenous people in Bolivia start getting rights and start getting recognized? And well, they got organized, you know. They got organized. The cocaleros got organized. You know, the trade union of the coca farmers got organized, and they started a political party, and they started, you know, raising people's. You know, that's what they did. They got, and so that was individuals who did. That was people, like, you know, so that's, you know, that's how did this thing in Hong Kong get going? Same thing. So I think the, you know, the problems are big, and that's undeniable. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's individuals who kind of get that going, you know. So, and my mother used to say, if at first you don't succeed, try and try again. That's a very useful dictum for all budding academics in the room.
So I'm going to unleash the collective wisdom of our students on you in a moment. But I would be remiss not to ask one question about my field of study, which is populism in its various forms. And I was wondering how you would shine light on some of the transformations that are happening now in countries that seemingly are within the narrow corridor.
Yeah.
The United States, even places like Poland, which seem to have managed to get into the narrow corridor, and perhaps we were overly optimistic about that. What explains these tremendous political transformations? And when you look at them from a longer range historical perspective, does that make you skeptical about all of the people like me who are quite worried about this? Do you think, you know what, you're firmly enough in the corridor that these things will somehow work themselves out? Or do you think there's a real danger that this can lead us to jump out of a corridor in a way that's pretty destructive?
I mean, you know, so I don't think anything I say, you know, is a kind of call for complacency, you know. So when we describe this sort of struggle, you know, in the corridor, you know, yeah, there's a lot of historical path dependency, but we also emphasize these examples where things go off the rails. So I think yes, you're right. I mean, I would say they go off the rails in contexts which are dramatically, worse than the current context. But sure, yeah, sure, you have to be worried about that. Absolutely, I think you absolutely have to be worried about that. And I think if you think about these European examples you're giving, since we're both Europeans, these are European examples. The European Union kind of underestimated how complicated it was, to change the institutions of these societies. You can't, Greece is more like Lebanon than it is England. No offense to Greeks in the audience, but I've been to all these conferences. I have all these Greek friends, and you go to a conference with these Greeks, and it's more like, it's more like Lebanon than it is England, and socially and politically, and so we didn't, and I don't know Eastern Europe, you know that part of the world much better than I do, but I think that's people underestimated how difficult it was to generate this institutional convergence. And I always think when something comes from the outside, there's always this kind of element of like illegitimacy. One of the things that's really been keeping me awake the last week or so is the thought that the British Supreme Court was actually created by the European Union, more or less, because it turned out that the old British system that they'd had, since King Ethelred the Unready or whatever it was, and violated the European Union's notion of separation of powers. So then they had to create this separate Supreme Court. So I'm just waiting for the populist Boris Johnson attack on yet another, European institution messing up the kind of democratic will of the British public. So I think there's always this whiff of illegitimacy that something comes from outside like that, and that's
well, certainly I think in the case of some countries like Poland or Hungary, your theory can help to explain what's going on. Because if we looked at some of the influential political scientists in the 90s and 2000s, they would have said democracies are consolidated when you reach a certain level of wealth, when you've had a couple of changes of government with free and fair elections. But when you look at it in this more long-run perspective, it's pretty obvious that in Poland and Hungary, the state has dominated over society for a long time. And so perhaps these 20 years when these two things seem to be in balance were a little bit of an illusion. And actually, the state was always stronger, and we're seeing a reassertion of that. I'm going to call on people. I'm going to try for a difficult balance here between state and society, which is to say that in this analogy, you're the society, and you get to ask wonderful questions, you get to ask harsh questions, you get to challenge James in all kinds of ways. But please have a genuine question mark at the end of your intervention, and keep the intervention to 20 or 30 seconds, because otherwise I, the state, shall step in and cut you off. Questions? We have one up here, I believe.
Thank you so much. My name is Evan Sankey. I work over in the Reischauer Center in our other building. I'm wondering if you could shed light on whether or not you think there are different types of corridors, of corridors of liberty. Like, it seems to me that you could imagine a type that's sort of more contractual, based on a constitution and laws that sort of mediate the balance. You could imagine a different type which is more of a proper balance of power, as you put it at the very beginning of your remarks, that's less legalistic. I wonder if you think that there's a difference. Thank you.
If I wanted to get more technical, I mean, we have models of this, which is not in the book. But in the model, in some sense, every country has its own corridor, because if countries have specific parameters, then the nature of the corridor is going to be determined by, the parameters, your country's parameters. So in that sense, we don't talk about that in the book. We thought about it, but we just thought, oh, man, it's going to be way too complicated to explain. The different specificities of countries, and China could have a very different sort of corridor because of idiosyncratic reasons, this notion of meritocracy, for example. But I think that, holding that constant, our idea would be, there's different ways of getting into the corridor. We say the way we try to, the language we use in the book is like there's different doors into the corridor, So if you thought about what the US did, when they wrote the Constitution or whatever, is they, that was a sort of, they kind of tried to lead, I mean, maybe the US was already in the corridor, but there were these kind of inconvenient things like slavery. But that's, I mean, I say that deliberately because one of the things that I like about the book relative to Why Nations Fail is that, Why Nations Fail, it made it sound, it was just too easy to go from, well, it wasn't that easy, but if you could go from extractive to inclusive, it was like too discrete. Whereas here, it's much more, it's a process. It's a process, it takes time, and it's ongoing, and I think, for example, that allows us to talk about the US in a much better way than we were able to before. But I'm not answering your question very well. But so I think there's different ways of getting into the corridor. You can contract into the corridor, maybe in the way the US did. You can come to some negotiation, or, we talk about, I think about social democracy in the 1930s in Northern Europe. In some sense, that was a kind of negotiation. It was a kind of particular coalition that helped cement a particular model of the corridor. So I'd say there's different ways of getting into it, but I wouldn't think about it the way you articulated it exactly.
I'm Walker White. I'm a first-year international development student here. It seems like everyone in this room has a vested interest in getting the majority of the world into this narrow corridor. And you mentioned earlier that individual contributions can have an outweighed impact in doing so.
Yeah.
If you're a first-year MA, second-year MA, and you're thinking about your career, you got a number of options. And we think about social enterprise, and then Hirschman comes in and tells you might be, aiding political instability or contributing to that, or you think about the World Bank, and Bill Easterly tells you that you're probably better off giving money away. Where are you most hopeful for people in this room to be able to go and have impact and bring the world into this narrow corridor?
Well, I always think, I mean, I've never really functioned in this space, but I always think that people don't have a proper theory of change. Like, if you think about it, change, or if you've ever read Banfield's famous book, The Moral Economy of a Backward Society, so this is his famous ethnography of the south of Italy in the 1950s. So this is like where this whole notion of social capital came from, basically. So Banfield kind of describes this village in the south of Italy and this kind of super dysfunctional equilibrium where no one provides public goods and nobody cooperates. And at the end of the book, he asks, how can this change? How can this society change? And he said, well, obviously, change isn't going to come from inside because the whole inability to cooperate and provide public goods is part of the problem. Change has to come from outside, And that's very common. Think about the US South. Think about the civil rights movement. Think about the role of outsiders in helping people organize in the South, people coming from the North. I have a very good friend who's a trade union activist in Britain, and he always says, companies never spontaneously unionize. You have to come from outside, and you have to help them unionize. So I think if you start thinking about it, change often comes from outside like that, So there's an equilibrium. I'm an economist. I'm a recovering economist. I won't drag you down with me. But in economics, there's a notion of an equilibrium, right? And an equilibrium is, a Nash equilibrium is no one has an incentive to change. Now, it might be a lousy collective outcome, but it's, so then outsiders can come. So I think in principle, yes, there's a powerful role for outsiders to come. In practice, it doesn't work like that, or it's very hard to make it work like that. I think because the incentives are messed up. The incentives of the World Bank are messed up. The World Bank has to deal with the politicians, and it has to deal with its development partners, in the Central African Republic, whoever they are, so you have this whole kind of charade, of the World Bank doesn't get involved in politics. So politics is the problem. So what are you going to do, But then I think that's true, but it's also true that it's really difficult to understand the politics in the Central African Republic. And is it legitimate also, to intervene like that? So then one has to think hard about how did that civil rights thing work? How did people from the North going down to the South helping voter registration, how did they keep their, why weren't they just a bunch of Yankees coming down to mess up the South, how did they maintain that legitimacy? And I think there's a lot of thinking to be done on that, if you want my honest opinion. I think development, international development institutions have got over this kind of, we'll just give the Congolese money and everything will be okay. Okay, that didn't work. Well, let's not give the Congolese money. The Congolese are screwed up. Okay, that doesn't work either. So now what? You know, now what do we do? You know, how do we engage in a constructive way, you know, with the Congolese? And I think, like, we still don't. We need a lot more thought on that. So if you can come with ideas on that, you'll be huge.
So that's an easy piece of homework for everybody here. Let's see, perhaps the, oh yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so well, the corridor is obviously fragile, right? But after these three big liberalization waves, no? 18th century, all the independence cycles, 1940s, post-war, let's say 1990s, you divide like three of them now, after which most of the countries have involved in what we call the establishment or the system, no? Has this corridor obviously become like strong enough not to like be able to afford, no, this gravitation, no, that China makes, no, because okay, they are like turning into the or trying to get at least economically inside the corridor, right? But will we say that this liberalization, no, if the term fits, of China, is enough to think on a fourth or fifth cycle of liberalization, you know, but with a different dynamic, you know? It's not like you have like this Occidental point of view, you know? Now we have like the rest of the world fitting to China.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I mean, one way of thinking about this, right, is that we assume, or the book assumes, I think, that there is a kind of universal value of liberty that people aspire to. What if that was the model of the most dominant societies? And so the reason why this particular model of society spread and was exported was because Britain and then the United States were the most powerful countries. And if China manages, and you may not be sanguine about that, to supplant the global leadership role of something like the United States, may countries not happily veer off the corridor and say we just have a different social model.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you thought about, you know, Chinese economic growth for the last 40 years, it's fairly clear that it comes from adopting a sort of very Western notion of like, how do you generate productivity? You know, like, what did Deng Xiaoping start doing? Well, it was sort of spontaneously happening anyway, but deregulating agriculture. You know, he got rid of prices, they deregulated prices, and they allowed people to decide what to farm and keep the benefits. That's the most basic idea in economic theory, you know, that if you're the residual claimant on your effort, that provides incentives, okay? And then they deregulated it. You know, they deregulated agriculture, deregulated industry, they introduced markets. That's what they did. That's what every economist would say. So there's nothing heterodox about that, it seems to me. So I don't think there's anything mysterious, you know, about that. So, and they had a state which had the capacity to provide order and invest in roads and public goods and kind of complementary inputs, you know. So that's the story of economic growth, you know. But I don't see, like, what's the model, you know, like what's the, you know, it's like in Africa people talk about the Rwandan model, you know, like I don't understand what the Rwandan model is, you know, like I don't understand what the Chinese model is. You know, the Chinese model is what? Benevolent dictatorship? I mean, when was there ever a benevolent dictator in Latin America? Does anyone name a benevolent dictator, you know, in Latin America? I think sometimes, you know, it can be that promoting economic development kind of happens to be in the interests of a dictatorship. You know, that's the way I think about the Chinese case, you know, that the former model was kind of politically untenable, you know, so they switched, okay? And they were very surprised at what happened. But I don't think there's no necessary connection between authoritarianism and economic success. In fact, the data suggests the opposite. You know, in fact, you know, it's not, democracy is positively correlated with economic development, not dictatorship. Of course, there's huge heterogeneity between dictatorships, okay? So dictatorship, you know, of President Kabila in the Democratic Republic of Congo looks extremely different from Chinese dictatorship. Why is that? Well, that has everything to do with the history of the state and the organization of the state and the relationship of the state to society. And, you know, President Kabila couldn't have done, you know, what Deng Xiaoping did, even if he'd wanted to do it, you know. So I would say, again, there's no Chinese model. There's no Chinese model in that sense. And even on its own terms, in China, I don't believe that's a sustainable model for prosperity.
So I would love, and I hate it when people do this, but I would love to take a question from a woman. And does anybody want to raise their hand and go ahead?
One second, get the mic. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Anastasia. I'm a second-year student at SAIS, and I study Latin American studies with a concentration also in conflict management. Populism was already sort of brought up, which is why I didn't want to ask the question, but kind of going back to populism, within this context of the cage of norms, I wonder if you can talk about populism in the West and in the United States, and also this idea that we hear a lot when populism comes up of we want a return to insert country name here values, or return to family values, or return to kind of like who we are as a people. Would you classify that as a cage of norms?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I guess, in the big sort of comparative discussion in the book, where we're talking about like the difference between Africa or the Middle East or Europe, and we think about this more kind of sociological stuff. I mean, it's good that Yascha brings that up actually, because I think he recognizes whenever I give talks about this, I can never get into that, and it's good because I think it's actually one of the most interesting kind of new parts of the book for us, which he identified that when we talked before about this. So I'm glad he's pushing me. So that's a good question. I mean, I think the big picture is, we relate this to the ability of society to kind of act collectively, to identify common goals and kind of consensus over public good provision, rather than being divided into, kinship groups or social groups, or, which are kind of much more antagonistic. And so we emphasize a lot that sort of sociological change. But you're right in some sense that there are those vestiges of the cage of norms even in Western society. That notion of conservative. We don't talk about that, but perhaps we should have thought more about it. I think you're right. Yes, that is connected to that. Yeah.
Great. Any more questions? Let's go here for a final question.
Hi. My question is about the middle class, and the question about how that fits into your parameters in the book. And I think in China, I think a lot of policymakers were waiting for the middle class to sort of, for there to be this sort of onslaught for liberty among the middle class. And a question I was thinking of is it that that's something that we are going to wait for? And the other thing is that has technology changed, has strengthened the state's capacity and weakened society's capacity?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not too much of a believer in this middle class story. That's a view that I associate with modernization theory, which Acemoglu and I, a decade ago, we did a lot of empirical work to try to show that the data doesn't really support modernization theory. All those regressions you were referring to by political scientists, they're even harder to get rid of than Jeff Sachs was. So I don't think, I think, if you thought about it historically, if you thought about the imperial Chinese state, they were very clever at finding ways of co-opting, what looked like the middle class, the gentry or something in imperial China. And I think they're trying to do the same thing now. Jack Ma's in the Communist Party, like the Communist Party's been sort of dramatically expanding. So I think that, the history of the Chinese state is they've actually been extremely good at finding ways of like co-opting people into this kind of system, giving a bigger slice of people an interest in maintaining the system, sharing the kind of rents, more. So I'm not very optimistic that there's some kind of role for the middle class in promoting political change, because I think, and look at the way they're trying to harness technology. That's all designed to kind of deal with that problem, it seems to me. So I think I believe more in the creativity of the Communist Party to solve that problem. That would be my feeling. Yeah, but and technology. My view about technology is that technology doesn't have any consequences. It's just depends on how it's used and by whom, you know. So I would say that's very much depends on political institutions. You know, if you're in China, then, you know, then you have like, you know, it's like an Orwellian, you have Big Brother. When George Orwell wrote, you know, 1984, it wasn't technologically possible for Big Brother to watch you, but now it is, you know. But in the United States, hopefully, there's more control over how these technologies are used. But you know, but the thing is, they also run ahead of our understanding of their consequences. I think that's become very clear in the last few years. Yeah.
So the bad news is that this event is now drawing to a close. The good news is that James has kindly agreed to sign copies of his book, which are for sale right outside the event. But before we do that, please join me in congratulating him on this wonderful book and thanking him for coming here today.